Yes, welcome to the Biz Communication Show. I'm your host, Bill Lampton. Every week, as you know, I bring a highly effective professional leader who has excelled and continues to in communication. We can learn from them in ways that boost our sales, our marketing, our management, our leadership, our customer service, and yes, our profits as well. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome as our guest on the Biz Communication Show, both on video and for those who are listening on podcast, Rich Bartolotta. Let me give you a couple of quick facts about Rich, who's had an extensive 33-year business executive leadership career. Rich Bartolotta is an insightful, results-oriented global business leader. His background includes extensive international experience as well as senior financial roles. He's currently a strategic partner in Schooley Mitchell, the largest independent telecom and merchant services expense reduction consultancy in North America. Rich began his professional career with IBM Corporation, working at several U.S. locations and in Tokyo. And while in Japan, 8 years, he spent time with NASDAQ and other great corporations. It's a pleasure now to welcome Rich Bartolotta to our Biz Communication Show today. Hello, Rich.
Hey, good morning, Bill. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Delighted. As I talk about and think about your international career, one of the first questions that would come to my mind and anyone else's, you are U.S. born, you're U.S. educated, you certainly could have had a magnificent business career here only. What is it that prompted you to spend an extensive, highly productive period outside the United States in your career?
Well, great question, Bill. I think, when I graduated college, I joined IBM, which, as you know, stands for International Business Machines Corporation. And at the time I joined, probably 2/3 of our revenue was international. So as such, I think the culture was very global and placed a premium on executives having true international experience, not just visiting countries on a 5-day business trip, but actually going overseas for a number of years and immersing themselves in the culture, both business and personally, and kind of growing and rounding out their experiences and skill sets that way. And at the time, IBM had really two headquarters, one in Europe, which was in Paris, which a lot of people wanted to go to, and the other was Asia Pacific, which at the time was headquartered in Tokyo, Japan. And for a number of different reasons, I thought Asia Pacific region just had a bit more diversity and some things that I found more attractive. So I kind of got myself lined up and went over as the finance executive or CFO for our personal computer business, which was at the time about a $4 billion business in revenue terms, and we were responsible for personal computers in all of the Asia-Pac region.
Well, it reminds me very much of a comment I heard years ago. The quite some time ago novelist Edna Ferber, there was a quip about how little research she did on writing her books. And one of the quips was that she said one time, "I want to write a book about Texas. Let's fly low over Texas." You don't learn a state, you don't learn a country, you don't learn a culture, you don't learn a people simply by, as you're putting it, sort of a commuting experience. You need to be there, you need to be immersed, you need to become a part of it, which makes me want to ask next, what about language barriers? Many of us in our ethnocentric approach think that English is the universal language, and so therefore if we're going to do business overseas, we don't need to learn anybody else's language. What was your experience and what's your advice with that?
Yeah, great question. I do think English is truly a global business language. But having said that, my experience going over there and working for a major corporation like IBM in a headquarters role and some of the other companies I worked for as well, English was very much the language we operated in simply because we had a headquarters location and you had a number of different expats. Some of the companies I worked for in Japan subsequent to IBM were much more local or Japanese, and there, the preference was to do business more in local language. And I took Japanese. I could probably get by a little bit, but I was not really comfortable necessarily transacting contracts and whatnot in Japanese. So a lot of times companies would have an interpreter that was available to you. But, net major corporations, I think they're going to transact business in English, certainly at a headquarters level. Local companies, obviously, the other end of the spectrum. But the interesting thing about the Japanese and many other countries, as you know, is people in those education systems tend to learn English to certain degrees. They may not be comfortable conversing or transacting business, but they do learn English often as a second language, and therefore have a little bit more comfort in doing business in those situations than maybe what we as Americans have, which is really a second language is kind of an afterthought. It's much more structured in Japan and a lot of the other countries that I had the pleasure of kind of working in on a business perspective.
One of the things I learned in my study of foreign languages is that learning a foreign language, it may not be so true of a language of Japanese or Chinese type, which is so different from ours, but I studied German, French, Greek, and Spanish. And with each one of those, it helped me understand English better because you find out the derivation of words. And going through those for my undergraduate and graduate programs was enjoyable. It was a great benefit, and I think it had lasting advantages. So some languages like that are, I think, easier to pick up. But I would assume that languages in Japan and China, and I think you worked in India, those are much more difficult.
Yeah, I think they're more challenging, but people I think that make the effort. It's funny. I used to take some basic Japanese language lessons, and there was a man, Kitani-san, that used to come through my apartment on Saturday morning, and we'd have coffee and go through it. But I know other IBM execs that put a lot more time and effort in and actually came away with a lot more knowledge than I did. It's a challenging language, but I think like anything, if you put your effort in and make the, do the effort and put the time in, you're going to get the benefit out of it.
We also, of course, not only have to adjust to the language of other cultures that we're working in, we have to adjust to customs as well. Did your company prepare you for that, or is this something that you just had to learn on your own? And along with that, what were some of the cultural adjustments that you found were required?
Well, I think IBM did provide a very structured process to help you get acclimated, and your family as well. So my wife, Peggy, and our two kids, Allison and Nick, were 10 and 7 at the time. So they did have a pretty formal program, certainly for me, going over of not only what to expect on a personal level, but what to expect and how to sort of interact from a business perspective. But, like anything, you get in there and things happen to you that, it's a learning experience. I mean, I remember getting over there and having some folks come into my office, to have a meeting to talk about a proposal that was going to be met. We were going to have a meeting in a few days on this proposal, and they came in couple of days prior to the meeting, and we went through it and we were talking about it. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I was kind of listening and asking some clarifying questions, but really didn't give any sort of indication one way or the other as to my opinion on it. And then fast forward a few days, we get to the meeting, which was the formal meeting with everybody on kind of the cross-functional teams. And at that meeting, I started to raise some concerns and objections related to this proposal. And that sort of really upset the apple cart, so to speak, because I kind of learned after the fact that if I really had serious objections, I really should have aired them a few days earlier so that everybody could understand that and try to resolve that. So when we got to the formal meeting, it was just that. It was a formality, and the decision had sort of already been made behind the scenes prior to that. And that's a term in Japanese called nemawashi. And you and I would think of that in our context as maybe pre-selling a proposal. But that can cause business in Japan from an outside perspective to seem like a very long process. Because if you think about it, people come in, they talk with me, I raise objections, they go back, try to resolve them, you raise objections, and it takes a lot of back and forth to kind of get to that final decision. But the benefit I found of that process is once a decision is reached, everybody truly has had an opportunity to voice their concerns, be heard, and have that be addressed. And the decisions then tend to stick and get executed a lot more effectively. Whereas again, in a US context, you and I may go to a decision meeting, we speak up, we don't speak up, a decision gets made, everybody's expected to kind of go off and fall in line and make it happen. And if you haven't had that pre-sale and that opportunity to voice your concerns and kind of get that addressed, then oftentimes maybe a decision gets made, but the organization hasn't really bought off on it. So, just one simple example, Bill, of how things are similar to what we do, but there are kind of subtle differences in the Japanese context.
That may be simple, but it's also very significant. And I would imagine, in fact, I know that in your future negotiations leading up to potential contracts, you were very aware of these nuances for that culture, and you took a different approach than you took that first time around.
Yeah, and you definitely, and I found, when I went over to Japan, I was an executive with IBM. I was probably 37, I think, at the time I went over there. And in the US context, obviously, we tend to be a little more short-term focused. We tend to be a little bit more decisive. And then you come in and you want to kind of bring those traits and those things that quite honestly led to your success up to that point into a new environment. And you can do that, but you probably aren't going to be as successful as if you step back and try to understand some of the nuances of the culture you're in and adapt your leadership style to fit that culture.
One of the things I would underscore is the big advantage you talked about is that through that process that you learned to adjust to, through that process, when a decision was reached, the consensus was much more solid, it was much more widespread, it was much more durable. Whereas in the United States, we might agree and nod, and we walk out of the room and people are grumbling and there's some backbiting and saying, my gosh, why did we come at it that way? And maybe we need to meet again, or I'm not going to follow this procedure. So in our, I guess we might borrow a phrase that's overworked here and say, in our rush to judgment in the current culture, the United States culture, we want to get it done. We've got to have a decision. This must be decided by next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Often, there are a lot of parties who remain unsatisfied because of that.
That's right. And again, I mean, in the simplest, and that's a great summation of it, Bill. And I think if you look at it as almost like on a timeline, as a US person, you'll feel like this process of nemawashi is taking forever, right? But then once the decision gets made, the execution moves quickly and there's alignment. Whereas to your point, we may decide quickly, but then we're going to spend a little bit more time, sometimes post-decision meeting, trying to truly get alignment and get people lined up to move. So it's different. I mean, it's not saying one is necessarily better than the other. It's just different, and you need, as an executive and a business leader, to understand that and be able to sort of adapt your style to be successful.
Rich, you mentioned your children a couple of minutes ago. Your family was with you in Japan during these 8 years. So the question I would have, I go back to decades ago, and learning about foreign countries decades ago in the United States, school children learned by reading books, by studying maps, by having a teacher give them a little bit more information. This was long before the internet. It was long before videos. And so we had a very, very, I guess an appropriate word would be very surface experience in trying to understand other countries, and not only understand them, even know anything about them. So what about your children who were immersed in that culture and that educational system? What kind of adjustments did they have to make? Also, what benefits did they derive from that?
Yeah, great question, Bill. I mean, they were very fortunate. They went to the American school in Japan, ASIJ. It was probably 2/3 American students, 20% Japanese, and then the balance were from, all other nations around the world. So they sort of had a very international school experience. Went on a lot of great field trips. We took our kids to a number of different places in Japan. And, to your point, I'll give you a couple of examples. I think we took our kids down to Hiroshima, where the atomic bomb was dropped, and we visited the Peace Memorial Museum. And there's a very iconic image of that sort of epicenter of the bomb. There's a bombed out dome that you see. That's the only building that actually survived that. And we're going through the museum, and you get to this one part towards the end where they actually have wax figurines of people, and they're trying to show you the effects that the bomb had on survivors, and really just very, very intense. And our daughter Allison was, I think, 10 at the time, just broke out in tears and ran out of the museum. It just got to be too much for her. So, I think we were probably the only Americans walking through that museum amongst many, many Japanese. So it's sort of just a much more intense experience to actually see these things and experience them, and experience them in a culture that was sort of on the other side of that historic situation. Another example, we took the kids to Vietnam on vacation, and we were up at the Hanoi Hilton, which, as you may recall, is where U.S. Prisoners of war were held and tortured, John McCain being one of the more notable people that went through that experience. And we're in the Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war location, and I remember there was a picture of U.S. prisoners of war, very clean, very well-dressed, sitting around a nice table with a lot of food. And my son said, Dad, I thought that, this was a prison camp and that these guys were mistreated. And there was an older gentleman next to us that I think was a Vietnam vet from the United States. And he looked at my son and he said, this is just a bunch of BS. And you just can't get those kinds of experiences, Bill, from, a book or a picture. You go in and you interact, and it's a little bit challenging because, as I said, you're an American in Vietnam, and you're experiencing things for the first time, but it's hugely beneficial. We took the kids down into the tunnels. If you remember, the North Vietnamese had a tunnel system below the ground that they used to travel about undetected. And we actually went down with a guide into the tunnels. And again, you can see an image of that and you can imagine it, but the appreciation you come away for, the courage it probably took for an American soldier to kind of crawl down in there and kind of put their life on the line. You just can't get those kinds of experiences from a book or a picture. It is truly just unbelievable to experience it firsthand and in the culture of where that historical context takes place.
I would say that the education that your children received in those schools could be top quality, and yet there's nothing to match the supplemental education that you gave them by these first-hand on-site visits. Rich, amazingly, that old clock on the wall has moved rather quickly, as it does when I have a fascinating guest who handles a topic so expertly. I know that there are people who are viewing our interview and also who are listening to our podcast who want your contact information. So please share that with us now.
Sure, it's my name, rich.bartolotta, BARTOLOTTA, at schooleymitchell.com, SCHOOLEYMITCHELL.com. And then my number is 678-436-5740.
Rich, now that you have given your contact information, I will share mine. Bill Lampton, the Biz Communication Guy. So naturally, my website is Biz, that's B-I-Z, bizcommunicationguy.com. We'll welcome your visiting my website and seeing a description of my services and also the opportunities you have there to have more information that will help your customer service, your sales, your management, and your interpersonal communication as well. Thanks very much again to Rich Bartolotta. Thanks to those of you who have been with us today on the video or on the podcast. And Rich, I know that probably your next meeting and mine will have golf clubs on hand.
That sounds great, Bill. I appreciate again the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to get together with you, and this was a great 20 minutes spent. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this with you.
We have just scratched the surface, Rich, of what you can share. So keep your calendar handy. We will be, if you're willing, we'll be talking again about your experiences and your advice about succeeding in business internationally. Thanks again to everyone who was with us today. See you next week.